How can you really know where something was made, or even what it's made of? It's easy to tell with real-life things, but what about the content on our screens? Now more than ever, verified authenticity is critical, especially with the advent of AI. That's why a global community, including companies, organizations, and civic leaders, have come together in the Content Authenticity Initiative. The movement's goal is to promote universal adoption of content credentials, the open standard for content authenticity and provenance that can be attached to images, video and audio files, documents, and more. Think of it as a digital nutrition label. Camera and software companies are already including it in their products. You can choose to embed content credentials in your files and make it clear for people to review. You can interact with this icon to see the origin and edit history of the file. Content credentials can be stored in the cloud for added durability. The underlying technology implements the C2PA open standard, and the Content Authenticity Initiative is helping make it more widespread with free open source tools. On top of that, we're working with educators, policymakers, creators, and the industry to speed up the adoption of content transparency. Together, we can create a world with trust and transparency built into what we create, share, and see online.
Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this Content Authenticity Initiative live session. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Always lovely with these sessions to see people coming from new places around the world that many I hope to visit one day. And yeah, so welcome today to this session. We're really, really grateful that you're here as part of the community, and that we're also really grateful to have some amazing panelists with us here today to discuss AI in the future of knowledge. So our last session for CAI was around kind of slop content and kind of this idea of AI generated content polluting the information ecosystem and making it really hard to kind of just navigate to what you actually cared about online. But what we're really dealing with now in the context of AI generated content is also just a complete degradation of the ability to understand whether this is actually a source of knowledge. Can we trust this? Can we know anything from this about the state of the world beyond our screens? And so today we've got two, excellent panelists to talk about some of these really important issues about how knowledge might be changing, or how it may not be changing, but certainly being made more challenging to form in this new landscape. And what we can do about it and where the impacts are being felt. So on that note, I want to welcome up today our first panelist, which is Elizabeth Seeger, who is an Associate Director of Digital Policy at Demos. And Elizabeth is doing some brilliant work leading on an initiative called the Epistemic Security Network, which I'm proud to be a member of, and I hope some of you guys will check out today. But Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us from the Labour Party conference in Liverpool, UK, as I understand.
Yes, thank you for having me.
My pleasure. And as mentioned, your work in this space, looking at kind of the way that AI generated content and, algorithmic systems are changing the way that we think about, or at least rather we're being challenged when it comes to knowledge formation, is really, really impressive. And you were one of the first to really start pioneering this. I guess an initial question for you is that we've titled this session AI in the Future of Knowledge, but there's a phrase that you and others often use to describe this space, which is maybe a little bit more academic. Those on the call who were lucky not to have done 4 years of academic philosophy might not be familiar with epistemic risk, which is the term that's used in the context of this network that you've initiated and the research that you've done. So I was hoping you might be able to kind of give us a bit of an understanding of what you describe epistemic risk to be. Kind of what do you kind of capture with that term when talking about these issues?
So you're right, it is kind of sometimes an unfortunate term in that it's a weird terminology, but it's the one that we found to best describe what we're trying to talk about here. So episteme is the root word here, and it means knowledge and understanding. So epistemic risk or epistemic security is another term we use, is about keeping our knowledge and understanding safe. And it's not just about information, it's about everything from how information is produced to how it's distributed, disseminated, modified, accessed, consumed, used to make decisions, shared. And all of that, of course, is going to have impact on things like decision-making, democratic decision-making, response to crisis situations, And so this epistemic security or threats to epistemic security, which are epistemic risk, can be quite problematic. So it's this umbrella term encapsulating all of that.
Gotcha. Okay, that's useful. It's one of those ones where I feel like I feel like I understand it, and then I talk to you about it, and the scope kind of feels quite overwhelming sometimes. But that helps kind of pin it down for me. I guess if you'll indulge me on the philosophical point for a second, I mean, I guess one question I have around kind of epistemic risk is the way that we kind of come to form knowledge actually different now that AI generated content is everywhere? I mean, have we really changed the way that knowledge is kind of formed? Is the philosophy hasn't changed, or has it? Or is this just about it being more difficult to come to positions of knowledge?
No, so the philosophy of knowledge production hasn't changed too much. You have some general sources of knowledge. It can be information discovery, it can be knowledge that you get from testimony or from observation. So information from observation is like you're doing scientific research, and you observe something or you see it with your own eyes. And the knowledge from testimony is knowledge that you get from somebody telling you something. And in both of those cases, knowledge from observation is kind of like the only place where you can really be like, I see that thing and that thing exists, and therefore I know that thing exists. But most of the observations we even do in day to day, we have some kind of technological mediator between us and that observation. So you look at something under a magnifying glass to help blow it up. And to some extent, you have to trust that the magnifying glass is actually going to convey the information to you that you're trying to magnify. We know how magnifying glasses work, so that's not a huge leap of faith. In early days, my history of science side coming out, but in early days of the telescope, when we'd go and look at the stars, or early days in microscope, when we'd try and look at these tiny wriggling creatures under a pane of glass, we would actually make observations about these things and write them down and pull conclusions like, well, there's weird little bubbles that are attached to the side of what we didn't know were bacteria at the time, or we draw conclusions about how stars are made or what they look like. And it was purely from aberrations in the lenses. Those bubbles were just the fact that your glass making skills sucked. But it was an aberration in that technological mediator of information. So when we look at AI systems, and how they produce information or consume data and then summarize it and give it back to us, that's another instance of a technological mediator of observation. And the leap is always, do we understand how that mediator works, and do we trust its output? So from like a basic philosophical standpoint, no, nothing much has changed. We still have technological mediators of information, and our trust in those is based in understanding how they work. It's gotten a lot harder to understand how they work.
Got it. Okay, that's super useful. And yes, I think that's certainly how I feel often nowadays, is precisely that. That it's like it just feels harder to get to those points. And I guess this kind of really ties into the epistemic risk framework and this kind of knowledge formation framework in this age, which I think a lot of people have started to realize with the proliferation of this kind of content, right? That actually, the systems they're making these assumptions on weren't that solid to begin with. One of the kind of the key questions I always think about with this, Elizabeth, is that, when people talk about kind of knowledge and this kind of use of AI generated content, it's often linked to things like disinformation and misinformation. And we have Andy Dudfield joining later, who can really give us a great rundown on that. But I think some people often think that's kind of the end of the story. But obviously your work is really looking at kind of the risk of not being able to form knowledge, properly, adequately, in a timely manner, for various institutions and for society more generally in other areas. So I was wondering if you could tell me a bit about some of the other risk areas that you really see epistemic kind of challenges coming into when it comes to just the functioning of society.
Yeah, so mis and disinformation is a large part of this. But of course, there are other issues that technology and issues with information that are throwing at us. And a lot of this just has to do with how we sift information, how we decide what to believe, how the manipulation of information can drive divisions in society, and then its knock-on impacts on democracy. I think so. One of the coolest projects that we're doing right now that I think really frames this question is we're doing this crisis scenario project where we're trying to understand. And I think you've been part of this as well. So I'm explaining this to you, but we can also discuss this back and forth. But we're doing this crisis scenario project where we're looking at varieties of different kind of civil contingencies or crises in society, things like economic crashes or environmental catastrophes or instances of xenophobic violence, and looking at how instances of epistemic or information system breakdown either cause those crises or exacerbate those kinds of crises. And I think this is really key to showing that it's often not just the technology and the information breakdown itself that is to blame. Like oftentimes, even in the context of this conversation, we're like, oh no, AI, disinformation, and democracy is going to be destroyed. Democracy is already having challenges, and those challenges come from things like rising cost of living, buckling public services, rising house costs, no one can buy groceries, where's childcare? Like these are the issues that are putting pressure on democracy. And then you add to that issues like disinformation, manipulation of public opinion, crumbling news ecosystems where people can't get information about their local communities. And this makes it so much more difficult to have the kinds of conversations you need to repair democracy, to build stronger relationships. And so we see this in different kinds of crisis scenarios too. So like in a xenophobic violence scenario, like we had the Southport riots in the UK, this was instigated by a real event that happened. There was a shooting, there was a bit of disinformation, a couple posts that were false about who instigated the shooting, and then it spiraled out of control. And tons of things contributed to this, from divisions that already existed in the community to the inability to authenticate content, to how ranking algorithms work. It was just the perfect storm that resulted in this massive crisis scenario. So this workshop, to come back to the workshop that we're doing, is basically getting a really great group of experts who work on different areas, but work on misinformation, disinformation, content moderation, all of these issues. And basically we started with a few different crisis scenarios and thought, how can we make these as bad as possible and understand where misinformation and epistemic crises are coming into play? And then how can we identify what the common interventions are in all of these different crises that we think are going to have the biggest impact in mitigating this kind of snowball breakdown of society.
Yeah, no, it was certainly, they're not, not workshops for the faint of heart in terms of, as you said, the kind of the sort of the paths that we go down. Yes. And I remember telling you the other day, Elizabeth, that I was moderating the the xenophobic violence situation, and I shared a summary with my friend, and his reaction was, "Oh my God, when did that happen?" Not this sounds like an interesting workshop. It seemed very real to him. And a lot of the situations that we're discussing are, very plausible. And I think this is it. It's that we're not really scoping in these problem sets kind of challenges which are not feasible right now, right? And I think we've seen that with economic cases, with fake images of the Pentagon causing the Dow Jones to temporarily dip. We're seeing this, as you said, in the context of coordinated inauthentic activity online from state actors around these kinds of events. I think one of the most interesting examples I saw of recent was when there was Israeli strikes on Iran. The amount of pro-Scottish independence accounts, their activity massively dropped, which seemed to indicate that this was all being, again, financed by Iranian proxy groups. So I think the landscape of epistemic risk, as you've just outlined, covers a lot of different spaces. In those workshops, yes, as you mentioned, we had a lot of different experts, but I guess a couple of questions for you here before we bring in Andy. But one is, who are the key stakeholders you see as really being responsible for tackling this? I mean, a lot of the people on the call here today are interested in content provenance, and maybe they're artists, maybe they're people working in news media, maybe they're people working in government or in technology, lots of different people. Who do you think are some of the people that are most responsible for kind of trying to address this? And what are some of the most promising solution approaches that kind of came out of this series of workshops?
So first of all, in terms of who is responsible, it's kind of a non-answer, but we're all responsible. But the reason that's true, though, is because the crisis that we're facing from epistemic insecurity or epistemic risk it's death by 1,000 cuts. There is no one thing that has happened that has posed this crisis. which means there's no one solution. Oftentimes in these areas, you hit walls because someone will say, well, what we really need is content provenance, which is great. We love content provenance, but they say, this is what we need. And then someone else comes in the side and says, yeah, but that doesn't solve all these other things. And then go, oh, okay, that's not the solution then. It's like, well, no, it's not the solution, but it's a huge part of the picture. So in terms of whose responsibility is it and who needs to be active, it's everyone. We need the tech companies. We need the developers of these technology platforms. We need social media platforms. We need the AI developers. Government obviously has a huge role to play in setting standards. Civil society has a huge role to play in providing this check on what government's doing and what companies are doing, and trying to inform and maintain those standards. Like organizations like Witness have a huge role to play in sort of calling out when things are not going well.
I see Sam Gregory was on the call earlier, so
yes,
shout out Sam.
Shout out to Witness. But the answer is, it's going to take an army. Death by 1,000 cuts will require 1,000 bandages, and that's how we're going to go through it. In terms of what we do, the cool thing about these workshops that we did is, so we looked at a really wide variety of different kinds of crises. We had economic breakdown, environmental breakdown, xenophobic violence. I think we had a legal system crash, and it was really distributed. But what we found is that there were some core themes and interventions that came up in every single one of those crises. And haven't published this report yet. It'll come out in probably a couple months. We literally just finished the workshops, so I need a little time.
Yeah, we'll make sure we can share it when it's out.
Yeah, but some of the core things we observed, the first one was content provenance and digital signatures as just across the board, this is something we need. From the perspective of protecting authoritative voices, like government in times of crises, and being able to authenticate that that's who's talking and giving advice, also in assisting users to evaluate content. The other big one that came up was crisis protocols for platforms. So if there's a civil contingency, if there is an ongoing crisis, what standards are platforms held to for evaluating content removal, or even just updating their content moderating algorithm? I'm sorry, my brain just died on what that's called. Content brain. There we go.
There we go.
That is a huge thing as well, and it requires doing difficult things like defining what a crisis is. But that's something we need to do, because during the Southport riots, for example, we saw some platforms did some kind of update in content moderation, some didn't, some worked well, some didn't work well. That needs to be standardized. There needs to be protocol, and that was across the board on all of these crisis scenarios. I think the other one which is unrelated to the technology itself, but is due prominence of real useful news on social media platforms. So especially local content. People are often very disconnected from local content because our local news ecosystems have been absolutely decimated by the rise of social media advertising systems. And what that means, though, is that if there's something going on like an election or a crisis, people don't often know where do I get help? What's happening in my community? Who do I turn to? Where are the resources? We have due prominence requirements for these kind of public interest information in newsprint, in broadcast media. Social media is another kind of media. It's where more than 70% of people get their news. So we could extend due prominence requirements to social media platforms as well, for local and public interest news. So those are three key things that came out just across the board, regardless of your crisis situation. These are the things we need to do to help.
Brilliant. Yeah, I certainly remember a lot of people kind of turning to content provenance in a way that was heartening for me, and I'm sure for many people here. But I love the emphasis on the fact that there is no silver bullet here at all. And, there is no kind of sole individual group that's going to be able to fix this all at once. This is a really complex stack. So
and that's not a reason not to do it. I think it's the big thing. You have everyone has to do the things. I
like that. Everyone has to do the things. That is going to be a good motto for taking forward, I think, content provenance policies. Elizabeth, thank you so much. Everyone in the chat, Elizabeth is going to be back at the end for Q&A. So if you have any direct questions for her, please do drop them in the chat. But I think for me, that's just so useful to kind of frame kind of what's at stake, where are the problems kind of emerging, and how we can think about responding. So Elizabeth, thank you so much.
Great, thanks.
Cool. So we now have our second guest of the session, Andy Dudfield, who is the head of AI at Full Fact, which is a fact-checking charity. Um, and Andy, if Elizabeth has been helping us kind of understand a little bit of the kind of the framing, some of the kind of more taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture, you are my man in the trenches who is fighting, or rather trying to help people understand this landscape. So thank you so much for joining and for kind of bringing your perspective here. It's so valuable. I guess, where are you seeing what you would see some of the biggest challenges from AI generated content in the kind of, I guess, understanding of what's real, what's not, what's true, what's fake? And also, is it something you see as overblown? Is it something that is like a crisis for you right now? What are you seeing? What is keeping you up at night?
Thanks, Henry. What keeps me up at night is many and various. My job is to look at stuff on the internet, so that definitely helps. I feel that we are beyond the point where we're talking about hypotheticals when it comes to AI generated content being problematic. I think we're well into the world of this being the here and the now. I was reflecting that this year is probably the first time as Full Fact as a fact checker has seen more AI generated content that we've been fact checking than we have just out of context media. And that's a huge thing for us, because I've always been saying, okay, the biggest problem is just stuff used out of context is a bigger problem. We don't need to worry about AI just yet. That's coming, but let's think about the here and now. I think we've flipped that over, and now we are seeing AI generated content being a core part of the work that we're fact checking. And that's coming from just multiple different angles as well. So that is audio content, that is images, that's creeping into some video content as well. These kind of things are part of what the landscape of bad information online looks like. And I think we're only, we have said we need to be prepared. We've got some good stuff in place across the sector, but I think there's a lot of challenges we're really facing in the here and now.
100%. I think that's that when you shared that with me about the fact that you're seeing more of this AI generated content than actually not kind of now was really startling, because the narrative for so long has been it's coming. And I think quite a lot of people perhaps overstated the prominence of AI generated content when it came to sort of, again, disinformation or polluting the information ecosystem, and to kind of hear from you on the front lines that was the case is quite startling, I guess. How do you see these kinds of AI generated content being used to kind of spread doubt or to kind of sow confusion? Is this something that's being done in a quite sophisticated manner, or is this something where you're seeing kind of like the kind of classic floods of falsehood, just like trying to flood the information ecosystem with AI generated content? I'm curious, what are kind of some of the use cases that you're seeing that are causing the most impact really right now?
Sure. So I think there is a mixture of things. So one example that we have seen, and this was we saw in the UK around elections last year, was audio content. That was particularly challenging for us in terms of content that was purporting to be politicians was coming through to us, and it was something that was getting a relative level of prominence. So we were taking a look from a fact-checking point of view, and that content was relatively low quality in terms of the audio was relatively low quality, but it was very hard to work out whether that was synthetically generated or not. And a lot of the time we're fact checkers, we're looking for the signals that sit around this kind of stuff. So contextually, is it likely that somebody said something? Have they, would they actually have admitted to saying that? Where does it originate from? What is the context that we first saw it? Those kind of things. And so we're able to kind of put a forensic picture around it. But certainly 12 months ago, we were already seeing audio content that it was impossible for us to verify whether that was real or not. And that was a challenging picture. And then we also see AI generated content around sort of information incidents, where we see a lot of information appearing. And so that can be at times of conflict, or that can be times of natural disaster. And we've seen a fair amount of that, unfortunately, this year. And that is often images. Sometimes those images are pretty low quality or seem sort of almost cartoonish, but people latch onto those things still as well. And they'll talk about the fact that it sort of creates an emotion that allows them to amplify the content. And sometimes they are more realistic. And I think we're seeing a picture in our world. We fact check in the UK, but we also work with many fact checkers around the world. That increase of AI generated content in conflict is growing. And adding to that we're already seeing a vast amount of out of context information used means that now when we're looking at things, we've got to work out, okay, is this AI generated? Is this an image from another conflict that's been used out of context? Is this something from a computer game, which is weirdly a very large part of what we see when it comes to conflict, of stuff that's taken from cutscenes from computer games and the like pieced together? Who is amplifying it? And then from our point of view as well, how harmful is it? And that's something that we're spending some time at the moment focusing on to try and work out with particular pieces of content. Is the AI stuff that we're seeing in that kind of lower echelon where it's perhaps people who are trying to make money quick from emotive things with AI, or is this a more coordinated thing, or is this a more serious thing? So we're going to be doing a bit of a study over the next few months looking at the idea of what are the consequences of people believing this information? And I think when we talk about harm, we try to be quite specific about that. And so is it incorrect? Is it believable? And then what are the consequences? What could somebody do if they believe this information? And that's the kind of rubric that we look at to try and understand if we're going to fact check something. And we want to try and make sure that when we're looking at AI content, we're clear on, is this because it's innovative or interesting that people are talking about it? Or is this actually, is there something that somebody can do? Is this going to change the choices they make about the medicines that they take? Is this going to change their ability to vote? Is this going to change where they pay their money, which supermarket they go to? Now, what is the consequence from this? And I think that's the area I really think we need to be focusing on at the moment, about what is the real world impact from this influx of AI content? Because it's undoubtedly there. The next thing now is to think about the impact from that.
Yeah, no, I love that kind of framing of the challenge. Again, as Matt mentioned, our last session for the CAI was on AI slop, and that content can be annoying. It can be it can crowd out other content in your feed, and maybe a post of an AI generated war veteran making cakes the shape of giraffes gets 10,000 likes, but it doesn't seem to be driving a huge amount of behavior. At least, again, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't get the impression that it is. Whereas, as you said, the kind of stuff that's actually driving people to act upon it, right? Again, and that's where knowledge, I think, is the framing here. Is like, I feel like I know something and therefore can inform my true view of the world and how I interact with the world. I think absolutely that's something that's still kind of being worked out. And it sounds like you guys have got some interesting stuff coming down the pipeline on that. So I look forward to reading it. But I guess a question for you, Andy, is that you kind of touched on this, is like you have a process for looking at AI generated content, or looking at content in general, to try and understand its authenticity, to do that kind of forensic work. And you mentioned that that's becoming increasingly difficult for you. But one other thing that I know that you've been kind of looking at is the way that other people's kind of confidence in tools as kind of revelatory of truth has kind of become quite confused in the AI age, and kind of not understanding necessarily how AI generated content has been formed, what actually is AI generated, and just sort of how this is maybe kind of warping people's understanding of how media is produced and what it actually represents. So I'm curious how you're seeing, whether it's deepfake detection tools that aren't reliable, whether it's, I think the example you had was AI upscaling, how these are kind of changing people's view of what actually media can represent, and maybe where that's misguided.
Yeah, I think there's a few things inside that I think are really interesting at the moment. So one of those is definitely that people have maybe a tolerance for what AI can do that is kind of interesting. So I work for a fact checker, we're independent, we're a charity, we have all these kind of restrictions and sort of like processes to ensure that we do stuff to the very, very highest standard, and we want to be as accurate as we can. But then you look at how people are using something like Grok on Twitter as a platform, X as a platform, and you see that it's not right all of the time. Sweeping generalization, arm wavy, maybe it's right 70-80% of the time. But for a lot of people, when they're using it and they're interacting and saying, okay, can you check this for me? Can you validate this for me? That's good enough. Like, there's sort of this tariff that people accept that AI is not going to be right all of the time, but it's going to be right enough to help them make decisions. And if you're on the Twitter X platform and search for Grok and full fact, you'd see that it uses our content all of the time. It's very tuned into that, and that's interesting for us. But I think one of the other things that comes from that is definitely that people are perhaps overconfident in what content can do for them, what AI can do for them, and they're starting to place trust in technology in ways that are really interesting to us. So, as you say, one of the things that we've seen is people trying to use AI to do things like enhance images, which I think is very interesting in terms of, I don't know if that's because people think that science fiction is real, or that people just feel like technology is moving so fast that it can do these kind of things. But we've seen a couple of instances this year where people have taken a look at images. There's an example on screen here of earlier this year, there was a weekend where Donald Trump wasn't seen for a couple of days, didn't do a press conference. And so people started, there was a conspiracy theory rumor disseminated online about the fact that he might be seriously ill. And a photo was taken to him on the way to, I think, play a game of golf. And then people just started using AI to enhance that image so that they could find out things that are going on inside it, which is not what AI is capable of doing, right? It's like this upscaling of stuff and starting to come to very illogical conclusions as far as AI is concerned. But I think it is interesting that people see maybe what OSINT tools look like. They have seen what AI can do, and at times it feels almost magical, our interactions with AI. And so they're starting to use it in ways that are way over and above what it's actually capable of. And I found that to be really, really interesting. And I think it's something that comes up time and time again when we're talking about what bad information looks like online, is that, and we always say a full fact, how does it make you feel? And if you look at something and think, oh, it's too good to be true, I can't wait to share this, that can be political stuff. That can be like your emotion of seeing a shrimp Jesus and thinking this looks really cool, or the Pope in a puffer jacket, whatever it is. That kind of connection comes through. And so these ideas that somehow all you need to do is to run a photo through a model and you'll get some sort of answer that only you'll be able to see is compelling. And I think that comes back to some of the things we're talking about here in terms of the content authenticity and the kind of the idea of being able to say whether something is from a camera or from an AI model. These things become really important in the way that we're looking at the information environment. So to say, I spend my time looking at bad information online and trying to work out what stuff appears to be the most harmful so that we can fact check it. That means looking at what happens in the UK and probably working with about 50 different other fact checking organizations to see what they're seeing in their information environments. And we're starting to see some signals of these kind of pillars, which I think are really interesting. So earlier this year, there were tragically, there were some wildfires in Los Angeles in January. And one of the things that we saw from that, the first time for us in the wild actually, was we saw SynthID embedded into some AI content. So we were able to look at something, and just by doing a sort of sticking the image in, doing a reverse image search, one of the things that comes up in Google at that point is this was generated by one of their models. And that's really interesting for us in terms of, it's not all of what we're seeing. I think it's maybe less than the fingers on one hand that we've seen this year, where we've actually seen that kind of identification baked into some content, not just in terms of a watermark on an image or something, but actually embedded in there. And that feels really important to me, that kind of ability to say, okay, this definitely came from a model. Doesn't make a statement about whether the content created was good or bad. It's just, we know that's one part of it. Backed up on the other side of saying, okay, this definitely came from a camera. We definitely know where this came from. Again, not saying what was said into the camera or the picture was good or bad, but they are parts of the sort of the scaffolding. And that means that our jobs as sort of frontline responders, thinking about what this stuff looks like, we have that extra infrastructure that helps us make the decisions we need to in terms of how easy, how authoritatively can we explain these things? How definite can we be? Because detectors are really difficult for us. When we try and explain that, if we had to sort of say, okay, this thing is 57% likely to be an AI piece of content, that is meaningless. I can't explain that as a journalist to a user. That number doesn't make sense to me. So, and these things give us authority. They give us the ability to say definitely and definitely. And that doesn't solve anything, as Elizabeth was saying, but they are two really important parts of a process. And I really have felt that we're starting to see something very powerful happening there.
For sure. No, I mean, it's really cool to see that this stuff is actually emerging in the wild. SynthID, that's Google's imperceptible watermarking solution they baked into some of their visual generative models. And like you said, I think, the fact that people are asking, hey, Grok, is this real? They're looking for free online detectors. It shows that they want to know what's real, right? They are crying out for solution approaches. It's just, as you said, it's kind of, putting your hand up and saying, well, look, I can't tell, and these solutions aren't reliable, isn't really an option for a lot of people. They just want a good enough approach. So I think, as you said, being able to point people towards solution approaches which are a bit more robust than some of those that maybe are the easiest and most alluring would be Brilliant. But Andy, thank you so much for that insight. I mean, you guys are doing difficult work in challenging times, and I'm really glad also that Shrimp Jesus made an appearance. Like that's a 10 out of 10 panel moment. So thank you for that. So we've now got about 8 minutes left for Q&A. So we're going to bring Elizabeth back up, and we've got a lot of questions that have come in, which is fantastic. So I'm just going to have a quick look at those now. I haven't had a moment to get to them just yet because we've had so many coming in. So we have one from Michael Barkin saying, can you elaborate on discussions of kind of proactive steps that we can take around, I guess, epistemic security and securing kind of knowledge foundations, kind of the structure and accuracy of knowledge bases that inform AI itself? So maybe that's the training data. How can we maybe think about, I guess, Elizabeth, maybe there's a little bit more towards you, but how can we maybe think about kind of securing the foundations of the systems, which, whether we like it or not, are increasingly part of our day-to-day lives now, as AI systems are, pretty much everywhere?
Yeah, so I think I'm looking in the Q&A. I didn't see that one. I don't know if you have a different source of questions that you're also looking at.
I may do.
You may do. Okay, I will also. I can answer that one as well. Yes. So I think that was an initial, like the point you made about it's the data in, data out, garbage in, garbage out thing. We already know that one of the best ways to prevent AI systems from producing certain kinds of harmful content we don't want them to produce is just to clean your data before you train the model. So I think like that's a very important epistemic foundation, is look at what you are feeding our content producing and moderating systems. I think that the bigger picture though, and this is always my role, I'm going to zoom out and look at the bigger picture and look at where these technologies are embedded. Because oftentimes the largest indicator of how vulnerable a community is going to be to mis or disinformation, regardless of the source, has to do with the trust that they hold in the sources of the information. And it doesn't really matter even what platform it's being communicated on or what the subject is that it's being communicated on. If people don't trust the source of the information, whether that's government or your doctor or whatever the source is, they won't be inclined to believe it, or they'll take it with a grain of salt. So if we need to think of, like, if you want to think of how do we strengthen those epistemic foundations, it comes to rebuilding trust in the institutions that are trying to communicate. And of course, that is extremely difficult. And oftentimes it'll have nothing to do with the information ecosystem. I was talking earlier about how, people don't trust democracy. People don't trust their governments. Democracy is already struggling. And that has nothing, it's not that AI caused democracy to struggle. It's that for many, many people, democracy is not serving them well. They can't make a living wage. They can't access healthcare. They can't. And so it is a large reform project, but it needs to start at that basic social rebuilding of trust. And then people will be more likely to believe the information source. So again, sorry, a non-answer, but it's a big problem.
It is a big problem, and I think it's spot on to kind of highlight those underlying factors as well, which are perhaps stickier even than this to kind of deal with. Andy, a question here from Brian McGuinness, who says there's a lot of cynicism when I talk with people, I'm guessing, around these issues. A lot of people that I speak to are highly skeptical that anything is going to work. And he says, can you give us something like an elevator pitch on what needs to be done and what people can do to help? And I guess as someone who spends his days looking at what might seem like an insurmountable amount of, difficult content to try and moderate, or to not moderate, to fact check, to help people understand, kind of how do you think about kind of trying to motivate people, to get people thinking there is something pragmatic we can do in these scenarios to actually, get things better? I'm hoping for a bit of optimism.
Yeah, I think at its very core, Full Fact, the organization I work for, is a hopeful organization, because we have to be. We have to believe that we're not here to just endlessly check things. We're here to try and ensure that the systems and processes, the ways that people consume information, are improved, and that trust is built up in good information. And Elizabeth, I completely agree that that's a really important part of the two sides of this. And I think with fact checking, it is not let's just check a fact and hope for the best. fact checking is an advocacy movement. It's about change. And so everything that we do, when you read a fact check, and this will be from many fact checkers around the world, probably somewhere in the second or third paragraph will be why we did that fact check. And that sometimes is because that person is very powerful and a lot of people have seen it. But a lot of the time it's because this is an example of something. And so this is an example of a standard that could be improved. And that could be as simple as a set of official statistics need a better name on the download of the spreadsheet because it's misleading in some way and it's being used and weaponized. It could be because policy that needs to be changed at an internet platform that needs to be a government level policy change. But thinking about how does those fact checks add up to evidence, they're an atomic unit that can be stacked up in so many different ways, is what kind of keeps us hopeful, because we can see that this work can change, and we can see that we can help people become more literate with what they're doing, and we can see that we can help people get excited by the way that the information environment is changing, and that we can build the confidence in people. So I think everything is about, the metaphor I think was something about 1,000 cuts and 1,000 bandages feels absolutely right. Like this idea that there is no one thing that is going to solve all of this, but some of the greatest people in the world are thinking about how to do this, and each of these things when added together will make a difference, is what I have to hold on to, because when we're united, we are better.
I love that. I love that message. Yeah, and I think that as I say, if we can all try and provide a bandage in some form or another, then we're gonna get healed up in a hopefully a quicker time than if not. I'm conscious of time, and we've got loads of great questions in here, and I'm really sad that I don't think we'll be able to get to all of them. But I guess just quickly, in response, I guess, to that, Charlotte Varsen here is asking if there's a European network one can join. She's based in the Netherlands, to help form or contribute to one of those bandages that are needed to secure epistemic security in civil society. And I guess off the back of that is kind of what Marissa Zalabak here asks, kind of what are kind of organizations such as your own doing to include kind of the different kinds of stakeholders that everyone kind of mentions, but who are often kind of seldom included in these processes. And one final question here, I just think this is a fascinating one from Benjamin Stratton, which is about kind of military government communicators operating in contested information environments, what foundational epistemic security skills should be part of their training. I think that's a fascinating one, particularly for you, Elizabeth, and maybe Benjamin needs to get involved in the epistemic security network. But I guess I'm just going to give you guys a kind of like 30 seconds, 45 seconds to kind of take what you want from those questions and throw out some answers.
Cool. I can just run through 1, 2, 3 of mine and then pass off to Andy. But on where do you get involved in Europe? I don't have off the top of my head where exactly the best place in Europe is. We at Demos are based in the UK, and we have the Epistemic Security Network that does focus primarily on the UK right now because we are a UK think tank. But we also are working in Canada and with some partners in the EU on various things and want to make this bigger. So please join the network in the UK, and as we grow and expand, be part of that journey with us, because this is a global phenomenon. Second question was around real world stakeholders. So at my organization at Demos, one of our big things that we do is about involving the public voice in our findings, in our research. We utilize citizen assemblies quite often. We actually just launched the largest trial of digital democracy in the UK right now. So for local policy making with councils, we're doing this through a platform called Remesh, which is sort of like Polis, if you're familiar, but basically ways that we can have citizens assemblies on the scale of like 1, 2, 3,000 people and have really rich dialogues and distill information and go back and forth and build policy positions for local government based on this dialogue. So that's one of the core things we do. And then on the what training do we do? That's a really hard question. I really like the angle in this question about, besides just identifying misinformation, what are some of the structural warning flags that we should be aware of? I think it comes back to this question of trust. Do people trust the information, the critical information sources, and what's causing that breakdown of trust? And it usually has to do with value misalignment. People don't believe that that source of information has their best interests and values at heart, either because they don't understand or they're just very disconnected. So see what you can do to rebuild that relationship.
Amazing. Thank you, Elizabeth. Andy, over to you.
I think we're pretty much at time, so I will say I wholeheartedly +1 to anything that Elizabeth just said. That was all amazing. From a fact-checking point of view, there is a European fact-checking standards network, which is impossibly hard to say, EFCSN as an acronym, which is where all the cool fact-checkers hang out. And also, I think in terms of the training and the literacy, one of the things that I keep coming back to is gaps in information. And I think one of the things we can do is we are debunking stuff. We're looking at things that are said and we're trying to make sure that additional context is added. There is another part to this of looking at where are there gaps? What is coming down the pipe that we know is going to be a problem? And how do we build up good information ahead of time? During the pandemic, we knew there was going to be vaccine hesitancy. Full Fact hired a doctor. What is the equivalent of that for the internet so that we can make sure that we at all times can get ahead of these narratives and start to build up the good information, because we don't have to wait for it to spread.
Amazing. I look forward to Doctor for the Internet becoming an official job title somewhere soon. Andy, Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining. I feel really, really lucky, and I'm sure our audience too, to have your perspective and expertise on these really pressing issues. And to everyone who joined today, who asked some brilliant questions, thank you so much as well for coming along, for being part of this, being part of this community. For us, this is what it's all about, is getting you together to kind of talk about these big issues, which are fundamentally why we're all working on provenance and working on our respective challenges to try and get those bandages in place. So with that, I'll say thank you so much. Thank you again, Andy, Elizabeth, and look forward to seeing you all again at the next one. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.